Hello, I'm David Dawson. I'm Director of the Wiltshire Museum in Devizes. I'm going to be talking to you today about Devizes in the Second World War, particularly looking at the home front. And one of the things I'm particularly relying on is this book, How Devizes Won the War, edited by Lorna Haycock, archivist. We can buy this from the museum shop when we're open, but also online from our website. So I've got a presentation for you. I'm just about to share that with you. So if you just bear with me a moment. And so we started off today at 11 o'clock. This is VE Day, by remembering those who died in the Second World War and whose names are remembered on the War Memorial in Devizes, looked after beautifully by Devizes Town Council. One of the things that I find really interesting is you get this idea that World War II sort of happened without that it wasn't expected. In fact, war was really expected from 1936, certainly by 1937. And air raid shelters were being constructed and men were being encouraged to join up into the Territorial Army already by 1938. And of course, people were then building aircraft shelter, air raid shelters in their own back gardens. But the thing that really marks the Second World War out is the fact that everybody was involved, one way or another. Everyone was involved. I think this advert from the Devizes Gazette and Herald really sums it all up, and particularly that this space is made available by Wadworth and Co. So real support in the community, and that is the essential part of World War II. Now, in Devizes, we already had evacuees in Devizes even before the war had started. Trainloads of children were brought from London to Devizes, including a whole school which shared the Devizes Grammar School. And over the first few months of the war, the population of the town was almost doubled, which is really quite scary, with families being encouraged to take on the children who had been evacuated. Now, there's relatively few records of the early part of the war. I think everybody was so busy just trying to deal with what was happening. But I think this is really interesting. This is 1941, and there's an exercise taking part in Devizes. And I think when you just look through that list of people and organisations that are involved, that how much is going on. So you've got a first aid party brought in from Market Lavington, fire service, decontamination squads, first aid parties. Everything is ready in case of an air raid or potentially invasion. And we've got a wonderful photo in the collection of that exercise taking place. It was at Devizes station, and they were doing a scenario of a bombed train. And you can see the number of people involved. Now, we were very fortunate in Devizes. There was no bombing of the town, but there was certainly plenty of activity. These are notes from the ARP warden's book of what happened when. And you can see this is over 2 or 3 months towards the end of 1940. But these are planes, German planes, that were heading over to Bath or Bristol. And so although some bombs were dropped locally, those were bombs being dropped by planes on their way back from their target. Unfortunately, there were no bombs dropped on Devizes. There was a bomb dropped in Potton, and a baby was killed. So things could happen anywhere. And certainly when Bath was bombed in 1942, people stood at the top of Cane Hill and could see the night sky lit up by the fires in Bath. So everyone knew it was very close. Now, one of the other things that happened was the canal was used as a defensive line. This is a photo of the pillbox at Rolleston, just by Devizes Wharf. And the idea was that the canal marked a stop line to stop the invading forces. This map has been produced by what's now Historic England, marking the locations of all the defences in Devizes. And it's very clear what they were trying to do. What they were assuming is that there will be a force coming up from the plain. So there are roadblocks and gun emplacements and pillboxes guarding the road in from Salisbury, and then the concentration on the stop line. The two pillboxes left, the one by the wharf and one up by Coe Bridge. Was the rest, everything else has disappeared. Now, one of the things that we found at the museum was that there was a story about there being an air raid shelter. And John Girvan, of course, always keen to look in any hole, helped us investigate it. And this was the shaft down into it. And when we went down, you can see John exploring here, we realised it wasn't just sort of something made out of tin. This is properly built. It's concrete, reinforced concrete with girders. There were two benches, one on each side, and we even found remains of a radio inside it. So this was, and the two holes you see at the end were for filtering gas during an attack. So this was not your average air raid shelter, and it's also not listed on the official ARP list of air raid shelters. And this is the plan. So the access hatch you saw at the back was at the back. That was clearly an emergency escape. And there were steps leading down. You can see the zigzag to stop bomb blast, and there was a full bomb blast door in the entrance. So this was rather more than an air raid shelter. This was a hideout, an operational base for what were called the Auxiliaries. Now, they were embedded, pretended to be part of the Home Guard. They were people who were living locally, who had local knowledge, but they had special training, just like almost like the SAS. And their job was, if there had been an invasion, was to go into this operational base, wait for the Germans to go through Devizes, and then to come out and to do what they could to disrupt the German war effort. Blowing up the canal bridges would be an obvious one. Now, at the time, the museum, this part of the museum, was the doctor's house, Dr. Wayland's. And so people could easily come and go without raising any suspicion. So this is what this was for. And a fascinating story, just to add to the pillboxes and everything else, the formal defences. Now, one of the other amazing things is that there was a very active women's voluntary service in Devizes. The WVS, as it was then, was set up in 1938, really to prepare for what was to come. And it's sort of showing the preparations that were in place, that everyone knew that war was coming. And the WVS, each area, would send a written report once a month to their central headquarters. And we got those from 1943 onwards during the Second World War. Now, these are kept by the WVS, what's now the Royal Voluntary Service Archive, which is actually based in Devizes. And these reports say what's going on. So in May and June 1943, you see there were dances being arranged for US troops because we've got the American base out where the Hopton Industrial Estate is, the procession for Wings for Victory Week, and then identity cards and ration books being written up for 20,000 people. Now, if you think about it, no computers, limited facilities for printing and so on. So actually physically writing the names and addresses on all these things, a huge clerical task, one that the WVS took on. In the collection, we've got this wonderful photo of the Wings for Victory parade. And you see soldiers, sailors, airmen. At the back, you can see the American troops. And just in front of the podium, I love the Boy Scouts in their hats, and the British and American flags on the podium. This was part of a series of efforts during the war to encourage people to put their savings into savings bonds. And in 1939, the town put £250,000 into saving bonds. Now, if you bring that forward into its value today, that's around about £3 or £4 or even £5 million invested within 2 to 3 weeks. An absolutely amazing effort. January and February 44, weekly dances for free for all Allied troops, not just the US troops in the Corn Exchange. I'm sure the highlight of many people's lives in the town. Every Saturday evening, and open house Sunday afternoons. And what would happen here is families would welcome troops into their homes. Now, remember at the time, food and drink was in short supply, rationing was on, but people would welcome troops into their homes on the Sunday because the troops were far from home, whether they were British or American. And this gave them a taste of home life. And there obviously a certain amount of fraternisation went on, as we all know. And there's a lovely story of Richard Oxman, who married a girl from Potton and went back to the States to live. And the Oxmans have become great supporters of the museum. And again, in that same month, book drive collecting 16,500 books and magazines. Remember, the war had been on for 5 years. There had been 5 years of salvage and recycling drives and all that sort of thing. But there was still, people were still contributing, still 16,500 magazines and books being given to the forces. What was also happening at this time was the ramping up of agricultural production. And of course, people were encouraged to grow things at home, on their allotments in the gardens, but then women were being conscripted into the ATS, into the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, but also into the Land Army. And here you see 5 land girls with a farmer. I think this is from a farm in Churton. The land girls went on a 1-month crash course in how to be a farmer. They were running those courses at what's now Dauncey School in West Lavington, because that was an agricultural school, and then they were allocated to farms. And there was a lot of reluctance by farmers to see these girls working on the land, but they really earned their keep. It's a fantastic plaque on the wall of the Corn Exchange, you can see, commemorating what they did. And we've got a wonderful recording that you'll be able to find on the museum website by Jean Davies, talking about her experience of being a land girl. February 44, the book drive again. School children being very keen. I bet they were desperate to get rid of their maths textbooks. But then you see camouflage nets being made. Look at the date, February 44. What's to come in the next few months is D-Day. Again, you get this idea that D-Day just sort of happened, as though one day all the soldiers were in their camps. The next day, they're on boats heading over to Normandy. It wasn't like that. Huge amount of planning and preparation. And those camouflage nets being made in villages, those were being given to troops, and those were then to be used in Normandy. And then knitting for the Polish Air Force. Of course, a reminder that the military effort relied on the huge contribution from the Commonwealth, from the States, and from the Free French and the Poles. And the Polish Air Force had a really important role to play in the Battle of Britain. It was in this month as well that Churchill visited Salisbury Plain, and that's a reminder that Salisbury Plain was incredibly busy at the time. It was the main place where troops were being trained, and Churchill had come to inspect the development of a new weapon, if I remember rightly. Again, in May 44, you've got another exercise by the ARP, Air Raid Wardens, and the WVS. And again, look at the date, May 44. Part of the impetus partly was probably the flying bombs, but more importantly, the authorities were planning for D-Day to go horribly wrong. What would have happened if the troops had been pushed back from the beaches of Normandy and had to retreat just as at Dunkirk? Now, in Devizes, we'd have something like 3,000 soldiers from Dunkirk were dumped on the green once they'd been evacuated, while they were being sorted out. So even in Devizes, the memory of Dunkirk was raw. And so this clearly is what's behind these practices and these exercises, getting ready in case. We had 5 Home Guard units in Devizes, each with their own specific tasks. This is the station Home Guard. You see the very proud owners of the motorbikes, because of course they will be taking messages. The main HQ for the town was at the town hall, just as it is in the virus pandemic today. May 44 again, collecting herbs, fresh food, vitamins. That's what the troops are going to need. And another savings campaign. This time it's Salute the Soldier. And again, that's really interesting because what they're doing is getting people to support the troops for what is about to happen. Of course, that's all top secret. People aren't to know. And I love this photo. This is soldiers billeted in Devizes. Now, in the very early stages of the war, we had huge numbers of children being evacuated from London. But as they drifted back home, they were replaced by soldiers. And at any one time in Devizes, the population was almost doubled, with a combination of civilians and soldiers being billeted on houses in the town. Back to Salute the Soldier Week, a ball raising £84, multiply that by 10 or 20, and similarly the Garden Fete. And then this is a picture of the Salute the Soldier Week parade. And you see the American troops, you see the tanks, you see the dignitaries on the stand. Looks surprisingly similar to the stand we saw before. And remember, these troops are heading off in a few days' time. They don't know it. The troops will be expecting it, but they don't know they're on their way. And civilian population certainly doesn't know that D-Day is about to happen. And so these troops go off with fresh memory of cheering crowds and that support as they head off to the dangers of Normandy. And just as a side, see the circular tank in the background? That isn't the fountain. That's one of the water tanks that were stationed through the town in case there were incendiary bomb attacks. And the building on the corner, and the top of that, you see there's sort of, that was used as an ARP warden because you can see the whole town from there. The soldiers' base was out at what is now the Hopton Industrial Estate. And this is an aerial shot taken from a Mustang that was running a sortie in April 1944. That pilot was training to take reconnaissance photos in enemy territory, and he was using Devizes as a practice run. And there are shots in the archive of that whole run. So he comes up over Roundway, banks over the Hopton, and then heads off towards Bishop's Kenning. And this shows the American base, and you can see tanks parked in the forecourt, and the figures you can see on the grass immediately in front of them. You can see there's a diamond worn in the grass. That's because the troops, the Americans, are playing baseball, which is a real puzzle for the Historic England aerial photograph team, who are trying to work out what on earth was going on the camp. Now into June properly, 250 evacuees currently in the town. Again, gives you an idea of the number of people in Devizes and what the stresses must have been in the town. And then demand from British troops for regimental signs to be sewn on tunics. Now that's really important because the way the army worked was that troops would be trained in particular battalions and then brought together as reserves reserves and reinforcements. So that change in unit means that they are just about to be sent over to France as reinforcements in June. So again, the troops that went across on D-Day, there was a constant supply of new troops, munitions and supplies going across the channel. I mentioned the Women's Land Army. This is a lovely photo of Land Girls with German prisoners of war. because we had prisoners of war in Devizes. There were Italians in the castle. Italy surrendered in 1943. So from that point, Italian prisoners of war were given much more freedom, and many of them did work on the farms. And then after the end of hostilities in 1945, German prisoners of war went to work on the farms as well, while the men were slowly demobilized and brought back. August 44, opening of a rest centre. This is in response to the V1 and V2 bombs, and you see people were installing mothers and children from a bombed area. And see how WVS members were collecting loans and gifts of household items. So this is 5 years of war, and people were still giving to support people who had been evacuated from in less happy circumstances. Some of these people, were from London, but we know there were 2 train loads of people from Folkestone, which of course saw heavy bombing during the war. This is another unit of the Home Guard, this time from Roundway Hospital. And again, September 44, evacuation, another 2 trains, and then 3 trainloads of German prisoners heading for the prisoner of war camp. Notice how it's the guards being fed with hot drinks, etc., not the prisoners. The prisoners were marched from the station through Rolleston, round by the cemetery, and then up Quakers Walk towards the prisoner of war camp, which was up at Hopton. And you see here the Germans being marched. There are stories of how much they stank, of the terrible condition that they were in, and they must have been so happy to be prisoners of war and out of harm's way. The prisoner of war camp itself was up where Lidl is now, and also the council depot. And I'm going to be giving another online talk about the prisoner of war camp that you'll see on the website. December 44, blood transfusion units. You know, the demand for blood for the troops was enormous, and there were constant drives to encourage people to give blood. But there is a respite, and children's Christmas party arranged, and with everything going on, they could still raise money to spend 5 shillings to all serving men and women from this particular village. They never say which village it is because of censorship. And then I love this photo. This is children playing on machine gun nest that's on the little green. You can see the houses in the background on the towards the London Road, and you can see the kids playing, because there was a machine gun and then there was an anti-aircraft gun alongside as well. April 45. People know now that the war is slowing down. The war is coming to an end. All knitting for the Merchant Navy has now been completed. So, you know, the sense of things being finished, which is really interesting. That happens from March 45 onwards. It's very much things are being finished and wound down. Still mobile canteen and tea cars, cup of tea essential as ever. And then with the end of the war, it came as a bit of a surprise for Devizes. There were no commemorations, no celebrations were actually planned, and we don't know of anything much happening on VE Day itself. But there is a record of there being dancing in the marketplace on VE Day +1. And this photograph was recently given to us by Mrs. Capon, and it must show that the dancing in the street on VE Day +1. A wonderful photograph, and you see the taillights of cars snaking through. Wonderful and evocative. But of course, the war wasn't over. It was to be August before the war came to a final end, and there were still prisoners of war in Devizes and still returning through into 1946. And I think the last prisoners of war went back in 1947, as opposed to those who actually still stayed behind in Devizes. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and if you want to get a copy of How Devizes Won the War, We've got copies in sale in our real world shop, but also you can order online and we can get them delivered to you. Then giving 3 more talks over the next few days, the next couple of weeks, which will be then on the website as well.